Another thing that I think it comes out of a number of the projects is that we're talking about technology, but it's not necessarily technology that has to be enormously expensive. And the example of that from my cluster would be the online writing lab at Coventry, who were originally starting to work with a proprietary conferencing system which actually didn't work. So they turned to a combination of Skype and Makogo, which is a completely free combination.
And we use that now.
And we use that. Yes. So it has transformed our mutual practice. So what more could you ask from a project output?
I think the work. I think you're right. I think the work too that's emerged in podcasting, for example, from a few of the projects, has shown that you can have a relatively low-cost technology with high impact to the learning experience and to the workload of the academic staff as well.
And the other thing about that is that, again, going back to CAL, is that has encouraged them to experiment with other technologies which aren't necessarily expensive. Like they're now starting to use audio inserts within Microsoft Word, which again is cheap, but notoriously well buried in the software until you find it.
This idea of, which came up at one of the program meetings, wasn't it, of looking at sort of, well, to put it crudely, getting your most bang from your buck, and it was Lester who brought up the idea of the quadrants of impact, maximum impact versus sort of lowest cost. And I think as we move into sort of more stringent times, perhaps we need to change mindsets a little bit from just sort of funding, everything's got to be funded, to one of looking at more from an investment perspective, and particularly prioritising investments. And I think that will then lead much more into, well, how can we learn from others rather than having to totally reinvent the wheel. And I think if it's one thing, one very important thing we've done is to sow that seed that actually we've got to take a more commercial approach to this whole aspect of investments in technology, and we haven't any longer got this sort of regime or environment where you can just have funding for doing anything.
Right, I agree with that, but I think taking Peter's example of using free tools, I think certainly in one of my projects cases at Hertfordshire, it wasn't actually about the technology per se. It was about funding people's time and engaging people in a process. And I think probably that's one of the most difficult things to do, because all the staff I've worked with in umpteen institutions will always tell you the same thing when it comes to doing anything different or even thinking about it. I don't have the time.
However, if you take Hertfordshire as a good example, because after the Pathfinder program, they developed the cable process, and schools had to bid for that to participate, and they were microfunded. But because the whole process was perceived, the whole viral network got going, and it was perceived after 2 years to be so good that nowadays they run it and there's no microfunding. And I think one can get away from that concept where people do see it's a valuable process, and I think that's what we've kind of got to start generating in people's mindset.
I think it's more than just time. I agree with the point you're making, Malcolm, but I think time and effort come together along with access, and I think I've certainly seen that in technologies like what's it called? Second Life.
Second Life. Your favourite.
Technologies like Second Life, where there's a real lack of staff wanting to engage in that technology because, firstly, it's not readily accessible within the institution. It requires a great deal of time and effort to master the technology and see where it can be used with effect in learning and teaching practice, versus something like podcasting, which requires little time to master the technology, has a clear benefit to the learner almost immediately, and is pervasive, is readily accessible at the member of staff's desk, to the students and wherever they happen to be, and that makes for a better success rate, I think.